Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wind Down Wednesdays. I'm your host, Paula Taylor, and this is episode 96. So tonight we're going to talk about trauma-based fears and triggering. And if you saw my Instagram or Facebook post about this episode, I actually decided to divide the topic into two different episodes. We're going to do at least 3 episodes on trauma-based fears. So tonight we're going to talk about what do I mean? What are trauma-based fears? Why is this important? And then next week we're going to talk about fear of responsibility and commitment or overcommitment. And then the following week, I believe we're going to talk about fears around belonging, the sense of belonging. And I will say that is the insight, the awakening that I had that started this whole series was these fears that came up about belonging. And I'm still figuring out how to talk about that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why this is so difficult to talk about tonight. But in tonight's show, we're going to focus on what do I mean by trauma-based fears. And we've talked about triggering before, but it's been a while, so we're going to talk a little bit about that, have it all kind of in one episode, because my goal for this series is to make it so that you can come back and repeat these as you're ready. And I don't know how many episodes we're going to do. I know right now we're going to do at least 3 episodes on this. So I want to start with a couple of disclaimers. When we are talking about trauma, I am not a mental health professional. I'm not a licensed mental health professional. I'm an energy worker, a body worker, a massage therapist. I do have a background in psychology, but I just have a bachelor's degree. I did not go on to my doctoral program as I was originally intending, which I've talked before about on the show a little bit. So when we're dealing with trauma, I like a 2-pronged approach, and one of those prongs is seeing a mental health professional. That is the best way to deal with the mental aspect of trauma and to start to delve into the emotional aspect of trauma. The other prong of that I think is completely necessary, and actually part of the reason that I didn't go into psychology, that I came into this body work, massage, energy work, spiritual field, is that we've talked about this before. Trauma remains in the body until it is released. So you need to deal with trauma mentally and emotionally, but the end of releasing trauma is actually releasing the trauma from the physical body, which is the same thing as the energetic body. So having an energetic release of trauma or a physical release of trauma is what we need to finally let go fully of trauma. And sometimes we can do that through talk therapy, through crying and releasing emotions that way. But in my own personal experience and in working with clients for almost 20 years as a body worker, I have come to realize that it really, the most effective approach is this 2-pronged approach where we have the mental health professional taking care of that, and then some sort of energy worker, body worker taking care of kind of the somatic, the body aspect, the energetic aspect of trauma. So that's my first disclaimer. And my second disclaimer is that trauma is cyclical. It is a cycle of trauma. So the very first thing I'm going to say about trauma, I'm going to talk about some of my own trauma, and that's a little bit why I had a hard time starting this series, because trauma usually involves other people, and it is not my job to blame someone else for my trauma, because trauma begets trauma. That's why we use terms like generational trauma, and I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural trauma tonight. So if you were traumatized in some way during your childhood, which I believe that every single one of us was, whether it was a generational trauma that happened in your family, a cultural or societal trauma. If you're a woman, you've been traumatized. If you're a person of color, you've been traumatized. If you are LGBTQIA, you have been traumatized by society. Pretty much all of us have been traumatized by our culture and society. We have built a culture of trauma. So if you were traumatized in your childhood, you were traumatized by someone else who was traumatized, by someone else who was traumatized. Like, this is a never-ending cycle. This is a vicious cycle. It is the definition of a vicious cycle. So I want to be very clear that when I talk about generational trauma, if I talk about my own personal trauma, I am talking about moving forward and releasing trauma with no blame for where that trauma came from, because the trauma came from someone else who was traumatized. And I bring up my dad a lot on this show, and part of the reason I do that is because he's no longer on this physical plane, and so it's a little bit easier for me to talk about that stuff, because I don't want to traumatize someone else by talking about my trauma, if that makes sense. But I am going to get into some difficult stuff in this series, and again, that was a little bit why it took me a little while to commit to doing this. We're going to talk about overcommitment and responsibility next week. But the other thing I want to say is I want to talk a little bit about cultural trauma. I live in the US. We had another mass shooting of elementary school children and I'm not going to get into the policy of that because that is not my area of expertise. I sure wish I had the power to change that, and you better believe me that I vote with life in mind as a pro-life person of people who are alive, as a pro-choice person for people to choose what they do with their own body. But this is not a political show, so we're not going there. This is a spiritual show. This is a show about energy work. And this is a show about changing ourselves, because we've talked before about how we change society by changing ourselves. And every single person living on this planet is traumatized. If you lived through the pandemic, you were traumatized by that. If you live in the US, you are traumatized by the mass shootings that happen on a more than daily basis. There are people living in war zones right now. We have created a culture of trauma, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I think people are starting to wake up to that, and that is, the timing of this seems very timely. It seems like this is a topic that kind of came up for me personally, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that over the next couple of weeks. But there is a reason that this is coming up now. And I talk about this spiritual work as excavation. We've talked about that before. We're getting spiritual tools to excavate. So what happens is that we excavate, it's like an archaeological dig. We excavate and we find some stuff, and we have to catalog that stuff and figure out what it is and kind of work through it. And then sometimes we need a break after that. And then we go down a layer, and sometimes you think you've excavated all the way down, that you're like through your layers, and then like, oh no, there's another layer. There's always another layer to excavate. And as we get deeper in this excavation, a lot of times we're getting to things that are much deeper seated, things that we've been holding on to since childhood. We talked last week about past lives. I have memories of a past life, several past life traumas. And even if you don't, we repeat cycles of trauma until we break them. And the only way to break a cycle is to realize that it's happening. Last week I did a card pull, and the second card I pulled that said past lives on it, I read out of the Osho Zen Tarot book. And what it said in the book was that we repeat these unconscious cycles over and over and over again, these unconscious patterns. And the reason we do that is because they're unconscious. The reason that I am so passionate about mindfulness and meditation and learning to be present, learning to be in your body, we're going to talk a little bit about what trauma does to the body, is because we cannot change what we're not aware of. It is that simple. That sounds simple, but getting to that layer of awareness is sometimes a huge step. And that is what happened to me recently. I went on a family vacation. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. And as most people know, family, we love our families, but our families also know how to push our buttons. And our families also have relationships with us based on prior experience. And that is one of the ways that trauma affects us. I'm going to tell a story tonight about that. But essentially, when you are walking around being unconsciously triggered, repeating these unconscious patterns of trauma over and over again, you're not seeing the world as it really is. You're seeing this reflection of trauma. And so what happens when two people meet and they're both in this triggered trauma state. There's a lot of T's tonight. You're not saying what you think you're saying because you're speaking through a filter of trauma. You're not seeing what you think you're seeing because you're seeing everything through a lens of trauma, and the same thing is happening to the other person. So we're walking around kind of in these little bubbles of trauma, bouncing off each other, and these are not gentle bubbles. There is a reason that we have so much violence in the world right now, and a lot of it is because we're not doing this work. We're not doing this inner excavation to recognize our trauma, because we can't change the triggers. We can't change how we behave when we're triggered if we don't know we're even being triggered. So I started before I even went on this vacation, I said, oh, I've got this thing at the edge of my awareness. And so I went on this vacation and I got triggered into this kind of traumatic fear about belonging that we're going to talk about in a couple weeks. So I'm not going to go into that now because I want to focus on just kind of what I mean by fear-based trauma. And it brought up a lot of stuff. And then more stuff came up. And then pretty soon I was like, because it's a lot. I've been doing this work for a long time. I started in therapy when I was about 19. I went to therapy for 4 years. I started spiritual work when I was 16, and I still get triggered by trauma. But my goal is to recognize when I'm triggered and explore that and develop the awareness so that the next time it happens, I maybe don't get triggered so quickly. I maybe have a moment where I'm like, oh, this is one of those triggering things. I need to take a step back. And so let's talk a little bit about triggering. Let's talk a little more about what I mean by trauma-based fears. So first, let's talk about triggering. We've talked about this before, but you could hear this a million times and still get something out of it, I think. I know I do. So triggering is when you have a response to a stimulus that is out of proportion to the stimulus. And a good example is road rage. Road rage is a great example of being triggered. So when somebody cuts you off in traffic and you fly off the handle, I mean, people have been killed in road rage incidents. This is not about the road rage itself. This is a triggered trauma of something else. This is a trauma-based fear that was triggered by like a seemingly kind of inane thing. Oh, somebody cut me off, but it brings up, I have a right to be where I'm at, and I need to get ahead, and all this stuff comes up that we don't recognize because, again, this is unconscious. And the next thing we know, we're in a road rage incident. That's a good kind of example. But this happens everywhere. This happens all the time. And so a way to know that you're triggered is when you find yourself kind of having a knee-jerk reaction to something. And someone says something, and again, maybe it's something, that's seemingly innocent. They didn't really even mean anything by it. And you're like, ooh, you get this oh, I'm going to kill him, or you get this sadness response. That is, triggering is not always anger. Sometimes it's fear. It's that fight, flight, or freeze. Sometimes it's sadness. But when someone says something to you and you instantly kind of fly into this really tight, either angry, sad, fearful reaction, that's a good indication that you've been triggered. And we've talked about spiritual processing before. We've talked about kind of dealing with triggers. We're going to talk more about that as we get into this series. I just wanted to kind of define it again. I'm going to tell a story that will hopefully kind of illustrate all of this stuff that I'm kind of defining in a more concrete way. So I want to define what I mean by trauma-based fears, because everyone has fear. We all have fear. It's just part of being human. We do a lot of work on this show to step out of fear and into love, to step out of that fight, flight, or freeze response and into an ease response. We're going to talk a little more about that as well. But when I'm talking about trauma-based fears, I'm talking about, we've talked about core beliefs. These are core fears. These are fears that started very early on in life, or again, even before if you believe in past lives. And these are like really deep-seated fears that we don't want to acknowledge. And so some of the fears that have been coming up for me, and we're going to talk more about this, but I've talked a lot about my fear of being unworthy, of being unlovable, of being unattractive, of feeling like I needed to look a certain way in order to be worthy of love. That's something that I have done a lot of work to work through, but I still get triggered about that. Again, this is kind of part of being human, is getting triggered. But what we can do with that is learn to recognize it, and eventually the triggering loses power. I do not get triggered in the same way I used to before I started doing all this work. Some of the recent things that I've been getting triggered on are also things that I thought that maybe I had worked through, like this feeling of that I don't belong, that I'm kind of an outsider. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. That is a trauma-based fear. That is a human condition fear. I mean, that is survival was based on being in a tribe. We're going to talk more about that. So that's the other thing. Essentially, a trauma-based fear is any fear, any kind of quote unquote normal fear that has gotten blown out of proportion, that feels like it threatens your very survival. That is a trauma-based fear. So, and usually these are emotional fears, not always. They can be physical, but a lot of times they're emotional fears. And emotions don't kill us. Sometimes it feels like they're going to. I was talking to someone earlier today about trauma, and we were talking about kind of physical versus emotional trauma. And this is someone who's experienced both. And she kind of said, actually, I think the emotional is worse. The physical I can kind of deal with. I can understand. I can wrap my mind around. But the emotional is the part that's got me feeling like I need to give up, feeling like I need to quit. And that's the other thing about trauma. It is draining. It is very draining. And so at any point in this process, I'm going to give you places to stop in the meditation tonight. You can stop anywhere you want. If you need to take a break, you can. If you are getting triggered just by like listening to me talk and you don't want to hear it, I got nothing. You can leave. I have no expectations and I have no bad feelings about anybody who's like, I can't do this right now. There is no shame in taking a break, in stepping back. And there is no shame in baby stepping this. Baby steps, baby steps. And guess what? After you take 10 or 15 baby steps, that's like 2 or 3 big steps. And that is how we have to kind of chip away at this, because it's a big thing. And that is something that came to me recently. Again, as someone who's done a lot of work on this, I would have said like, oh yeah, I'm at ease. I'm not traumatized. I've worked through my trauma. Like, nope. It's coming up big time right now. And again, I think we're deciding collectively to start dealing with this, to start looking at this. I have seen on social media over the last 24 hours, people, I am tired of thoughts and prayers. It is time to do something. And we are doing something in this work. We are making actual change in ourselves. And that ripples out and changes society. Again, that is one of the reasons that I do this. And I do this for myself as much as anyone who's watching or listening to this. So let me tell my story that I think will kind of illustrate what I'm talking about and why this is so important. So I had a little bit of a disagreement with my husband last night. And I'm not going to go into the details about what we were talking about. That's not really important. But essentially what happened is exactly what I said earlier on. I was in a triggered trauma state. He was in a triggered trauma state. And so what we thought we were saying to each other was not coming out the way we thought it was coming out. It was coming out through this like filter of trauma. Like imagine you've got a Darth Vader mask on and you think you're saying like, turn left at the corner or whatever. And what's coming out is like, you're the stupidest person I've ever known or whatever. This is not what happened, but that's just an example. So we were both in kind of a triggered trauma state. And so neither one of us was hearing what the other person was saying. It was coming through a filter of trauma. Neither one of us was saying what we thought we were saying because it was coming through a filter of trauma. And what happened was, it was kind of like escalating, and we don't really fight. We don't disagree a lot. We we've been together a long time. This was actually, we went to dinner for our anniversary, and this happened at our anniversary dinner, which is kind of funny. But we were getting into this topic, and it started, and he said something to me like, he was trying to ask for what he needed emotionally. And what he thought he was saying was something like, I'm going to need some grace and understanding on this. This is going to be hard, and I'm not sure how it's going to go. That's what he thought he was saying to me. What came out was, I'm going to need you to not be resentful about this. You're going to have to just get over it, or something like that. And those are two totally different things. That the intention and the way it actually came out, it did not come out the way he thought it was coming out. First of all, that was coming through his kind of trauma filter. And then what came into my filter was, you're an unlikable, basically. Oh, I'm not supposed to, I'll have to bleep that out on the podcast, but I'm in it now. We're in it tonight. So what I heard was, you're unlikable. And it instantly triggered this like unworthiness. No one likes you. No one cares for you. You never do the right thing. You don't respond well. Like, all of this stuff started coming up. And so I was getting more and more triggered, and he was getting more and more triggered. And so a little ways into this, like, meditation teacher Paula kicked in and was like, wait a second, something's off here. Like, you're triggered, he's triggered. What are we trying to actually say? And so when I said, hold on a minute, let's stop here, because I don't think either one of us is getting our point across. I don't think either one of us is hearing what the other one is trying to say, because it's not coming out through a loving filter right now. It's coming out through this kind of triggered trauma. And so it turned out what he was feeling from me was that I think that the things he does are stupid. I think he wastes his time. And that was coming through his trauma lens of that productivity that we've talked about a lot. That's a good trauma-based fear. I am not worthy if I'm not productive. If I am not doing something that someone deems worthy, I am not worthy. My worth is tied to my production. So what he was getting was coming through his lens of, my worth is tied to my production, that fear. And what I was hearing was coming through my lens of, I'm not worthy, I'm unlovable. And so when we were able to stop and sort of recognize that, like, I saw through the haze of my own trauma. Again, this is why meditation is so powerful, because when you can develop that bystander mind, that observer mind, even in the midst of this kind of argument, my little observer mind was like, wait a second, I think this is what he's trying to say. It's not coming through, the way he thinks it is, and it's certainly not being received the way he wants it to be received. So I kind of stopped and I said, wait a second. I think what you're trying to say is that you need some grace and understanding, that you want me to understand that this is going to be difficult and we don't know exactly how it's going to go. That is not what is coming through, but I think that's what you're trying to say. And he said, yes, that is what I'm trying to say. And so then we had a whole conversation about these trauma-based fears, and the fact that his fear of not being worthy because he wasn't producing was being triggered. And my fear of not being worthy because I'm unlikable or unlovable was being triggered. And all of a sudden, the whole conversation changed. And it was like, wait a minute, we got totally off on a tangent here. Like, how can we find the meaning of what we're really trying to say, the objective meaning? Because again, we're walking around in these bubbles of trauma and things are getting triggered, and pretty soon, so the example of this, these are two people. I have been with my husband for 23, I always get that off, 15 years of marriage and like 23 years together. That's a long time. Like, we clearly love each other. We're clearly committed to staying with each other. And so when a misunderstanding like this can happen with two people who really love and care for each other because of this trauma response, these trauma-based fears being triggered, imagine how this goes in a situation where you don't really know the person, or in a workplace situation. No wonder we get these escalating events. Think about police shootings. these are people who, people of color are traumatized just by being alive. And so they're carrying this trauma. And then police are traumatized because they choose to go into this job that is dangerous. And probably everybody has the best intentions to begin with. Not everybody. I don't want to say everybody does. Some people are just not good people. But for the most part, I think the vast majority of us are coming from a good place. We want to be good people. We want to have good relationships. We want to be heard and understood. But the problem is, we're all walking around with our trauma lens and our trauma filter. And so what we see is not what's really happening. We're seeing through that lens of trauma. What we say is not what we really mean because we're speaking through this filter of trauma. And if we could even be aware of this, like the awareness of this is what changed the whole conversation with my husband and me. Me saying, hold on a second, I think we're both triggered. And of course, I've been doing this trauma work, so I knew I was triggered. I've been triggered for a while. It's been it's been trickling out for a while, for a few weeks now. And I knew, the minute he brought this subject up, I was angry. I was like, and again, you didn't say it in the way he thought he was saying it. So I was a little bit justified in my anger, but again, the anger, it was like a hot flame of anger. And I'm not really usually an angry person. So when you get that hot flame of anger, you're triggered. When you get that rush of shame or guilt or sadness, you are triggered. Anything that's that big, deep rush of what I'll call a negative emotion, an unpleasant feeling emotion, is generally triggering. And so hopefully you can see from that example how important it is to recognize when you're triggered and then start learning ways to step out of being triggered. And sometimes the easiest thing to do is to just say, I need a few minutes. I can't talk about this right now. I need to step away. Sometimes just removing yourself from the situation is sometimes the best way to give yourself time to process the triggering. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in the body when we're triggered, and then we'll get into the meditation because it's going to tie kind of right into that. So when you experience trauma, you become disembodied. Your consciousness actually leaves your body. That's actually well documented. There is a reason that what they used to call multiple personalities is now called dissociation, dissociative identity disorder. Especially when we're being physically traumatized, if you're being sexually abused, if you're being physically abused, the way that we protect ourselves is that our consciousness can actually leave our body. And so it happens through emotional trauma as well. It's just a little bit more intense with any kind of physical trauma. So most of us are walking around kind of floating outside of our bodies somewhere around the head. We've talked about this before. So the first thing we have to do to start moving through trauma is to come back into the body. And that's a process. I was just talking to a client today about that. This is a retraining process. So the first thing we have to start with is getting out of fight, flight, or freeze. Because if you're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, you're not thinking. Your rational mind is shut down. You're just reacting, and your body's getting tighter and tighter, and that emotion is getting flamier and flamier. That hot flame of anger is now like an inferno. So the first thing we have to do is train our body to come back into ease. And we do that every week with our oxytocin breathing, with our meditation. That is how we train our body to come back into ease. There's other ways, but those are the ways I like, with sound. We do that every week as well. So we got to get out of fight, flight, or freeze because we can't make any change until we're back into an ease response. And then we have to start training ourselves to come back into the body energetically, to occupy the entire body. We did that great Roots show, which is one of my favorite meditations. And we talked about how your body is like a house and you're living in the attic of your house. But there's a second floor and a first floor and a basement. And there's a beautiful foundation that you can tap into. So those are the kind of the first two steps to start working through trauma, is to re-embody yourself, is to learn how to come into ease. And that takes a while. So sometimes before you can do any actual release of trauma from the body, or deep kind of even emotional exploration, where did this trauma come from? How do I let this go? First, we have to come back into ease, and we have to come back into the body. We can't make change in the body from out of the body. We have to be in the body to allow that change to happen. So we're going to talk more in the next couple weeks about some of the specific trauma-based fears that come up, and how to recognize them, how to work with them, how to step out of that triggering, how to bring some kind of affirmations in to support us. I am still working on that. I am lovable and I am worthy. That affirmation comes up all the time. And that is something that, and again, at the base of all of these trauma-based fears, we're going to label some different fears, is that feeling of unworthiness. That is kind of at the base of any fear you get to. And again, your worth is tied to something. Your worth is tied to your production, like that conversation with my husband. My worth is tied to how I look, or whether I'm lovable, how likable I am. I have been a chronic people pleaser my whole life because I don't want to say no to people. I don't want people to dislike me, because I'm trying to earn my worth by being likable, by being meek and small and malleable. And that is something that I have been working through, and you have seen me work through this on the show. This is possible. And it does sometimes feel like I had these traumas kind of, these fears triggered recently, and it was like, I haven't made any progress at all in 20 years. And you start kicking yourself, and then, and then the shame, the guilt, and the unworthiness, then that vicious cycle gets kind of activated, that shame spiral, as Brene Brown calls it. So the first step out of all of that is to do some deep breathing, come back into ease, recognize that the story that your mind is telling you is just that. It is a story. It is not the truth. The story your mind is telling you is a trauma-based, triggered story. I had this beautiful discussion with my friend Paul Bucky from BioTouch the other day. And we were talking about how everybody's just walking around in their own little world, including him and me, because of this kind of thing, because everything's coming through your specific lens. And so that is why we train ourselves through things like meditation and expanding our energetic field and developing clarity. So my 3 words for healing are clarity, expansion, and harmony. When you are triggered, you are not clear. You are as muddy as it gets. When you are triggered, that clarity is gone. When you are triggered, you are contracted. You are not expanded. You are contracted physically. Your energy field actually contracts in, and then you start to feel trapped. You start to feel like there's nowhere to go because you've become so contracted. And then all of those disharmonies start bouncing around even more. So essentially, getting out of trauma is the same as any other process of healing we've talked about a million times on this show. Bringing clarity to that muddiness, to that muddy thinking, because the thinking's not clear when you're triggered. Letting ourselves expand fully down into the body, into the earth, out to the side, bringing that beautiful flow of love and light in. When we are in ease and we allow that love and light in, we know our worth. I know my worth. 90% of the time now, I know my worth. I feel it because I have done this work and this training. So I know that I can get to that place, but it's hard when you're triggered, and that is why we practice. So in our meditation tonight, this show's going a little bit long, but it feels really important. I'm glad I didn't try to do 2 topics in one. So what we're going to do in our meditation tonight is just focus on the first 2 things I talked about. Getting out of fight, flight, or freeze and into the ease response, using those beautiful oxytocin breaths for that, using some sound for that, just inviting that love and light back in. And then coming into the body. We do that every week. There's a reason I do that every week, because we all need practice. We all need practice bringing our awareness all the way down through our feet. And then I'm going to do just a little bit. If you would like, you can stop at any point on this. So if you're in fight, flight, or freeze, just stick with that part of it. Stick with the breathing. Let the sound come into your space. Just listen to the affirmations. But I'm going to give just a few little prompts about just starting to think about, what is it that triggers you? How does it feel in your body when you get triggered? How can you recognize this moving forward? Because again, the first step is awareness. We can't change that which we're not aware of. So I think that's where we're going to leave it tonight. Just a couple of little prompts. Again, I want to keep this gentle. Trauma is overwhelming. Dealing with the aftermath of trauma is sometimes even more overwhelming than going through the trauma. So this is a supportive, safe space. And I'm going to say one more time, as I did at the beginning, please get help. Please see a therapist. Use this two-pronged approach. Watch the show, do the spiritual stuff, reach out, get energy work, but get mental health professional help. That was too many H's. You deserve it. You deserve to feel safe. The world is not a safe place. It's never going to be a safe place. It is a risk being alive, but you can train yourself to feel safe. Even if it's 90% of the time, that's a lot better than 10% of the time. That's a lot better than 0% of the time. Some of us are in that fight, flight, or freeze pretty much all the time, even when we're asleep. So let's train ourselves to come into ease. Let's start thinking gently about trauma, and then let's see where we go in the next couple of episodes. So let's meditate together. So for this meditation, come into a nice, comfortable position. If you'd like to lie down, feel free to do that. If you'd like to sit up, make sure you're supported and comfortable. Bringing the body back into ease requires the body to be comfortable, or as comfortable as possible. You may still have some discomfort, some tension, even some pain. But we can train the body to come into ease even with those things going on. Even if you're in pain, you can actually train your body to come back into ease. So let's start, as we so often do, with at least 4 to 5 deep oxytocin breaths. You're going to breathe in through the nose, let that belly float out strongly. And then as you exhale through your mouth, you're going to sigh that out, moving from that higher pitch to the lower pitch. That audible sound vibrates your vagus nerve. That plays a huge role in bringing us out of that fight, flight, or freeze and into ease. And as you complete these beautiful oxytocin breaths, notice the shift in your body. Even taking that one nice breath I just took, I feel like my shoulders have relaxed a little bit. Feel a little tension release in my chest. So let's do a few more of those. I feel some tension release in my belly. We hold so much tension in the belly. Take another nice deep oxytocin breath. This time focus on your hips and your pelvis. You may have forgotten that they're even down there, walking around thinking in that mind all day long. We forget about the low part of our body. So allow that crown chakra, the top of the head, to open. Invite that beautiful, warm, loving, golden light, that unconditional love and light that we are made of, that is our worth. Inherently worthy. We need to do nothing to earn our worth. Invite that feeling in through your head now, into those thoughts that circle around that tell you you're not worthy, that you're not good enough. Let this light wash that thought away, even if it's just for the next few minutes. Allow that light to flow into your chest and your upper back. Let it come down each arm through your upper arms, into the elbows, forearms, wrists, and hands. Let that beautiful light come into the chest, the upper back, into the belly and the mid back. Take a nice deep breath here into the belly, and as you sigh it out, let that beautiful light, that worth, that love flow into the low part of your belly, the low part of your back, into your hips and pelvis. Take another nice deep breath in through the nose. As you sigh it out, let that light flow down your thighs and into your knees. Becoming aware of this part of your body. Feeling yourself present in the knees now. Take another nice deep breath in. As you sigh it out, let that light flow down through the lower legs into the ankles and feet. Send those beautiful strong tree roots down from your feet, from the base of your spine into the earth. Ashatanaye daye. Ashatanaye. Strong roots growing down into the earth, spreading out. Imagine that you're a 400-year-old sequoia with a huge root system, a huge amount of space to occupy. You do not need to earn your space. You do not need to earn your safety. You are beautiful and worthy of love just for being who you are. Allow yourself to feel that in your body now, if you can. Continue those deep oxytocin breaths as you feel you need to. If you still feel like you're tense, if you still feel like you're in that fight, flight, or freeze, continue those breaths. Continue to call that light in through your body. Continue to send your consciousness, your awareness down through the body and into the earth. Such beautiful support from our Mother Earth. If we only allow her to support us, if we only see that we're worthy of that support. We're going to step into a little bit of sound now. And as I do the sound, as we did last week, I'm going to give you a few prompts to think about, to explore trauma. Do not go here if you're not ready. Stay with the breathing. Just let the sound come into your space. You don't have to delve into this trauma. You can come back to this at any time. Let yourself be easy with this. Let yourself go with the flow. Just enjoy being in ease for perhaps the first time all day or week or year. If you'd like to now, from this very safe space where nothing can harm you, just let your mind explore. this question: what trauma-based fears have I been holding on to? How do I get triggered in my trauma? What does it feel like in my body when I'm triggered? How will I recognize it going forward and know that I've been triggered? How do my fears, how does my trauma tie into my feelings of self-worth? What am I tying my worth to? Is it production? Is it how I look? Is it how materially successful I am? Is it how smart I am? Is it how funny I am? What am I trying to do to earn my worth? And remembering that you can come back to this at any time. Let go of those questions now. Just let yourself be in ease. If anything came up for you during those questions, take some nice deep breaths. Use that oxytocin breathing. Breathing in through the nose, sighing it out. And once more, invite that beautiful light and love, that unconditional divine love, to flow into your head, to flow all the way down your body like a waterfall. Let it fill the space around your body. Let it fill the room you're sitting in right now. Let this love that you so deserve come into your space. Reconnect with this. This love is always available to us, even when we're triggered. We just have to remember to let it in, to let ourselves reconnect with it. Hey, 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 hey. You are so loved. You are so worthy. Let yourself feel that. No matter your past, no matter your present, even when you're triggered, you are worthy and you are loved and you are lovable. There is nothing you can do to send away that unconditional love. It is always there. Let yourself feel it. Let yourself open to it. Ashanaya Dhyana. Ashanaya Dhanaya. Ashadanayana. You are loved. You are worthy. You are divine light. Breathe in that light now. Let it clear up any muddy frequencies, any muddy thoughts, any muddiness that triggering, that trauma has left in you. Let it become clear now. And if it doesn't feel that way, that's okay. Just set the intention for clarity. Become open to that clarity and it will come. Set the intention to expand. Expand that space, that capacity for unconditional love within your own body, within your own energetic field, within your own life, within your family, within your coworkers, within your social circle. Expand your capacity for love. Set that intention and it will be. And finally, set the intention to bring harmony within yourself. Thereby bringing harmony into the space around you, into the world at large. The more harmonious we become, the more harmonious our world becomes. Let us bring that harmony in now. We deserve that. And we owe it to each other to step into love and harmony and light. In spite of our fear, we can have fear and still invite love in and still step into love to our capacity, and that capacity will grow. Take one more nice big deep breath. Breathe in that beautiful light and love. Sigh it out. Feel that connection with that rich, dark support of the earth. If you'd like, you can gently allow the crown chakra to close or leave it open for the highest good. Let that beautiful waterfall of light flow down the body one more time, from the head through the torso, down through the pelvis and the legs and the feet. Allowing yourself to be in flow with your own divine nature. You are worthy. You are loved and lovable. You are light. Claim that light, claim that love, and share it. As you're ready, you can gently begin to move your feet and hands, move your head and neck. If you feel really relaxed and you're in a safe space and you'd like to go to sleep, you can allow yourself to do that. If you're coming back to the rest of your day or evening, then just do some gentle movement. Practice this breathing throughout the day. Give yourself the gift of coming back into ease as often as you can, and recognize that you deserve that. Sat Nam. The truth of our identity is that we are divine light. We are worthy and we are loved. As you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Join me for the next at least 2 episodes where we're going to continue talking about some specific trauma-based fears. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to feel loved and worthy. You deserve to recognize when you're triggered so that you can give yourself the opportunity to step out of that and back into ease. Have an easeful rest of your evening and week, and I will see you next week for Wind On Wednesday.